So welcome to the second half of our evening and the continuation of our exploration of the Buddhist path of ethics, meditation and wisdom. And a particular welcome if you're joining on YouTube. So this is the third week where we're exploring Buddhist meditation a little more deeply. I'm going to start with a brief recap on what we've learned so far. So in week one, Atulimati introduced us to the Triratna system of practice, system of meditation. She explained that we have a comprehensive system which comprises of various stages and includes a number of practices, some of which you'll be familiar with, like the mindfulness of breathing as part of the integration, as an integration practice, and the metta bhavana practice, which we did this evening, which fits within the stage of positive emotion. She also introduced us to a quote by Sangharakshita, the founder of the Triratna tradition, where he emphasized that one of the fundamental purposes of meditation is to raise our whole level of consciousness. And that's the subject of my talk this week: access concentration and something called Dhyana. So last week I talked about the challenges to meditation, and this week I'm going to talk about what can happen when things progress for us. But the challenges, or the hindrances as I called them, are really key. In fact, they literally are one of the keys to unlocking these higher levels of consciousness, or super conscious states as they're sometimes referred to. So let's just remind ourselves what these hindrances are. So I talked last week in terms of hindrances to our meditation practice and hindrances in our meditation practice. So the first list are just some of the common challenges we experience when we begin meditating, although some of these can continue and re-emerge at any time during our meditation life. But it's the second list that we need to really pay attention to. So what are sometimes called the gross hindrances of sense desire, ill will, restlessness and anxiety, sloth and torpor, and doubt. So I'll be coming back to these again. So you need to really remember this list, start to really remember this list and start recognizing them in your own experience. So this week I'm going to be talking about access concentration, and as I said, something called Dhyana, which is a term for higher states of consciousness from a model which is well known and used in many traditions in the Buddhist world. And in the rest of my talk, I hope to be able to give you a sense of what these are, some ways of recognizing them, why they're important, and how we might start accessing them. So I need to say a little bit more about these hindrances, as it's their eradication that can give us that initial key to accessing these higher levels of consciousness. So as this is an important aspect of beginning to move towards these higher states, we need to be really clear about how these hindrances arise and appear in our own experience. And we also need to start understanding how they manifest in our day-to-day experience off of our meditation cushions. So how deeply are we looking at the connection between our meditation experience and our ethical life? And of course, as I mentioned last week, Buddhism is about transformation. So we need to start to understand how we might begin transforming our lives and slowly developing a more and more sensitive ethical approach to our actions of body, speech and mind, which in turn transform our experience of meditation. From access concentration, we then literally have access to these higher levels of consciousness. So in general terms, the experience of access concentration will be one of deepening concentration, with distracting thoughts having little power over us. We'll feel we have more energy available. There's often an unconscious adjustment of straightening our posture, our emotions and thoughts start to cooperate instead of continually pulling us into distraction. And there can be an overriding experience of deep pleasure. So with the eradication of these gross hindrances and the arising of access concentration, we can then begin to move towards the Dhyanas. Now, in this model, we have descriptions of the key characteristics of the various levels of Dhyana given by the Buddha from some of the ancient Pali scriptures that we have of his teachings, where he uses a number of very poetic similes to describe these. And I find some of these deeply rooted in a culture that I don't really recognize. So for me, understanding these more deeply at an experiential level, the best way for me to have been able to do that was to just start to understand what I call the constant aspects within the experience of higher levels of consciousness. So these are not the only positive factors that you might experience. This is not an exhaustive list, but in experiencing some of these, we can begin to notice a change in our consciousness. So this is a summary of the widely recognized, what we call Dhyana factors. And I'm going to speak briefly about each of these in turn. And one classification of these is to think of them as either emotional or thinking or cognitive in nature. So I want to start with the one which I feel is most useful to recognize, and that is rapture, also known as priti in Sanskrit. So I remember the first time I experienced this, and it was not long after I'd started meditating. I was living at home with my parents, and I had this little shrine in front of my bedroom window, which I had hanging in the window, these little crystals. And I had this most wonderful physical experience, almost like an all-body experience of pleasure. And it just seemed to come out of nowhere. And I remember thinking afterwards that I hadn't really been trying very hard. I was just really very relaxed. And when I opened my eyes, there were all these rainbows in the room where the sunlight was reflecting off these little crystals. And I've never really experienced that level of sensation since in the following 35 odd years or so. But what it made me realize was that meditation could be deeply pleasurable and joyous. And one thing that can be really helpful, and certainly been helpful for me in my practice, is just to reflect on my experience of pleasure and joy in meditation. And this relaxing and experiencing of deep pleasure was something that the Buddha recalled prior to his enlightenment, when he remembered sitting under a rose apple tree as a child and just experiencing a deep sense of enjoyment. And this rapture can manifest in lots of different ways, from tingling in the hands, goose pimples as hairs stand on end, little shock waves like repeated flashes of lightning, or it can be that whole all-body experience that I described. So I'm going to return to rapture in a moment, but I'll briefly look at the other factors. So the other emotional factor alongside this physical pleasure is a deep sense of bliss, which can come about when we relax further. And it has a flavor of a really, really deep sense of peace. And this is associated more with our mental experience than the slightly coarser experience of rapture. Now, the other three factors are, as I say, more cognitive. They're more about our thinking mind. Firstly, we have initial thought or initial attention. So this is the initial movement of attention to the meditation object, i.e. or e.g. the breath, or one of the individuals in our metta bhavana practice. Now, this may occur a number of times as we bring back our attention following a distraction. So we can just imagine, like, of all the things that you can think of, the billions of things that you can think of, you think about your breath. You bring your attention to your breath. So secondly, we have applied thought or attention. So this may be characterized by a continuous period of awareness of the meditation object, but it also can be thoughts arising that are directly related to our experience of the object. So more thinking about the object rather than thinking of the object. So against all the odds, we've thought about the breath, and then we'll continue to think about the breath. And it may be that we start to have a detailed examination of the breath. Is it deep? Is it shallow? It's still the mind thinking, but those thoughts are directed and not just random interruptions of what's for tea. So thirdly, we have one-pointedness, sometimes called one-pointed concentration. So this is a mental state which is experienced as a focusing of attention and intention. So it's like a collecting and unifying of our meditative energy. So there's an experience of uninterrupted unification with the object of our meditation. And one way of thinking of this is a bit like going from a torch, which has a really wide beam, to one which has a really sharp pointed laser-like focus on the object that we're turning our attention towards. Now, in the Dhyana model, all 5 of these factors will be present in the first Dhyana, the first of the sometimes 4, sometimes 8 Dhyanas. And then as our concentration deepens, some of these begin to fall away or become transformed. So for example, in the second Dhyana, concentration is so pure that our experience, we have no experience of thought whatsoever. Any discursive mental activity just fades away with increased concentration. And I remember first hearing about this experience after I'd become reasonably proficient at being able to recognize these factors and experience the first Dhyana. And I became quite worried, even quite fearful. So the idea of not being able to think was really difficult for me to understand. And that fear, that concern about going further really sort of held me back for quite a long time. So it wasn't until I learned to sort of trust my experience and to let go that things started progressing for me again. And I was helped very much by an experienced meditation teacher who sort of guided me through that period of time. So I don't want to spend, and I haven't got a lot of time now to spend on the other levels of Dhyana. And I think that should be plenty to be going on with. And first Dhyana is the really important one for all of us. So how do we progress in our practice so that we can start experiencing these higher states of consciousness? Firstly, don't bother buying crystals for your window to create lovely rainbows, as lovely as they are. I have moved on from that. I was only about 18 at the time, so I kind of forgive myself for that. Well, firstly, I will say it again, we need to move toward the experience of access concentration, this first gateway level. And to do that, we need to become aware of our ethical life and to look at what changes we can make and how these are reflected in our ability to deal with those gross hindrances. I also want to just say something about a technique that I've used to good effect to help me move from access concentration into the first Dhyana. And this involves that emotional factor of priti or rapture, the first one I spoke about. So when I begin to experience this, and for me, the sensation is usually around the base of my spine, but it can also be the back of my neck or sometimes around my heart center. I very gently and very carefully turn my attention away from the meditation object and onto the pleasurable sensation itself. And if I do this carefully enough, then what can happen is that pleasurable sensation begins to grow and can become quite pervasive. It's certainly very enjoyable. And then when I first started to try this technique, I often got excited. So as soon as I felt that tingling, as soon as I realized that I was experiencing that priti, that rapture, that excitement usually caused that pleasurable tingling to disappear, often instantly. So nowadays I can do this very slowly and carefully, but I don't tend to stay with this too long. Instead, what I do is allow myself this pleasurable experience, and then with a slightly deeper breath, just relax a little more which tends to move me towards the deeper experience of bliss. And as I said at the beginning, and probably said last week, you need to experiment with your own mind and see what works for you. So remember, you need the gross hindrances to have dropped away first. You can't just sit down and turn towards the pleasant feeling in your hands while still working out what you're planning to make for lunch later on. So my experience is that there's no shortcuts in the spiritual life, and there certainly aren't any shortcuts to high levels of consciousness. And now this all might make it sound like every time I sit down, I ease smoothly into Dhyana. Well, that simply isn't the case. But what I do is when I go through a prolonged period of absence of these Dhyana factors, and my meditation feels a bit workmanlike. It feels like I'm trying quite hard and not really making any progress. It's usually sort of time for me to look at my ethical life and become aware of what's blocking me and what's blocking me from being able to quiet and still my mind. So the important things are work on the hindrances. And then when things start to settle, be attentive to these dhyana factors, particularly rapture, and then gently turn towards that in your practice. So look for the joy in your practice and turn towards that. And then when we do this in a single sit, we may become really concentrated. We may have that experience. We may actually think that all those factors are present, but then we may just become distracted again. And it's perfectly possible and quite likely that these experiences won't last for long periods, at least to begin with. That certainly was my experience. And I just need to realize then that I'm just caught up in those everyday hindrances and begin to work on those in the way that I've learned. So it's important not to become disheartened, but instead just use whatever works for you to temporarily remove that hindrance, relax again, and bring our awareness back to our meditation object. And then once we restart our practice by turning back to the breath, for example, it's important to realize our mind won't be the same as when we first sat down. So the fact that we've entered into a high level of concentration, no matter how briefly, will change the nature of our mind, even just briefly, so that the next period of our attention is different. So it can be progressive in that way. So next week, we're going to begin to turn towards some of the Buddha's wisdom teachings, which, as I said earlier, really for these to begin to be truly understood, they need to be approached with the depth, brightness and luminous nature of higher levels of consciousness. And that, of course, is the real purpose of our meditation, so that we can develop these higher states, and during those we're able to contemplate some of those teachings. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate the link between ethics, meditation and wisdom, and also to give you a little bit of an idea of how to cultivate, recognize and develop these really important states of mind. So that's all for my talk this evening. So if you've joined via YouTube, thank you very much for being with us.